If you were forced to walk past someone suffering and do nothing, could you live with yourself? If your heart told you to stop but your mind said keep walking, which would you listen to? Prepare yourself for a deeply moving story of struggle, resilience, and unexpected connection that might just change how you see the world around you. The sun was setting over the quiet suburbs of Portland, Oregon, casting long shadows across the cracked asphalt of Evergreen Road. It was an ordinary Tuesday evening in October, the air crisp with autumn's bite, leaves skittering across the pavement with each gust of wind. For most residents, it was just another day winding down, but for two souls, one human, one feline, this evening would mark the beginning of a journey neither could have anticipated. Michael Reynolds, a 42-year-old construction worker with calloused hands and tired eyes, was driving home after a 12-hour shift. Recently divorced and still adjusting to the hollow echo of an empty house, Michael had fallen into a predictable routine. Work, drive, eat, sleep, repeat. The monotony had become a comfort, a shield against the pain of starting over at an age when most people had their lives figured out. His rusted blue pickup truck rumbled along the road, the radio playing softly in the background, some country song about heartbreak and redemption that he wasn't really listening to. Michael's mind was elsewhere, calculating bills, wondering if he should call his daughter tonight or if she'd be too busy with college assignments, contemplating whether he should stop for takeout or force himself to cook something at home. The plastic bag was so small at first, just a white speck on the horizon that Michael might have missed entirely, if not for a strange, almost imperceptible movement. As he drew closer, slowing his truck instinctively, confusion creased his brow. The bag wasn't just moving with the wind. It was writhing, jerking in erratic, desperate motions that made his stomach tighten with unease. "What the hell?" Michael muttered, pulling over to the shoulder, hazard lights blinking in the growing dusk. Common sense told him to keep driving. It was probably nothing, maybe just trash caught in an unusual air current or some small animal scavenging. But something in the frantic energy of those movements spoke of desperation, of a struggle that resonated with a part of Michael he thought had gone dormant. The pavement was rough beneath his work boots as he approached cautiously, the dying sunlight making it difficult to discern details. It was just a small white grocery bag, tied tightly at the top. But as Michael got closer, he could see it more clearly. The bag bulged and contracted rhythmically, and now he could hear it too. A muffled, high-pitched sound that made his blood run cold. Michael knelt down, his heart hammering against his ribs, and reached out with trembling fingers to touch the plastic surface. The bag jerked violently in response, and the sound intensified, a plaintive, terrified cry that was unmistakably feline. "Oh, God," he whispered, fumbling in his pocket for his pocket knife, a sense of urgency overtaking him. Inside that tightly knotted bag was a cat, a living, breathing creature deliberately trapped and discarded like garbage on the side of a busy road. The realization hit Michael like a physical blow, rage and disbelief warring within him, as he carefully sliced through the plastic, mindful not to harm whatever was inside. The cat that emerged was barely more than a kitten, its small body soaked with sweat, orange fur matted against trembling skin. Its eyes, vivid green and wild with fear, locked onto Michael's face with an intensity that made him catch his breath. Those eyes held questions he couldn't answer. Why would someone do this? How could anyone tie a living being in a bag and leave it to suffocate or be crushed under the wheels of a passing vehicle? The kitten didn't run when freed, perhaps too weak or too traumatized to move. Instead, it lay there, sides heaving with desperate breaths, small pink tongue darting out to moisten dry lips. Michael noticed with growing horror that the cat's left front paw was bent at an unnatural angle, and dried blood crusted around its delicate nostrils. "It's okay," Michael found himself whispering, though he knew it wasn't, knew that nothing about this situation was remotely okay. "I've got you now, you're safe." The words felt hollow. What did safety even mean to a creature that had been treated with such callous cruelty? But he continued to murmur reassurances as he carefully removed his flannel overshirt and fashioned it into a makeshift nest. With gentle movements that belied his large, rough hands, Michael scooped the trembling kitten into the soft fabric, cradling it against his chest. He could feel its rapid heartbeat, a frantic drumming that seemed too powerful for such a tiny body. The kitten made no sound now, watching him with those unblinking green eyes that seemed to contain universes of suffering. Thunder rumbled in the distance as Michael stood, kitten secured in his arms, and looked up and down the deserted road. There was no sign of whoever had done this, no retreating figure, no suspicious vehicle, nothing but the encroaching darkness and the first fat raindrops beginning to fall. "Who did this to you?" he asked softly, knowing there would be no answer, knowing that even if he found the person responsible, no explanation could ever justify such an act. The fluorescent lights of the Evergreen Emergency Vet Clinic buzzed overhead as Michael paced the small waiting room, his work boots leaving faint dirt marks on the linoleum floor. It had been almost an hour since the veterinarian, a kind-faced woman with prematurely grey hair, had taken the kitten into the examination room. The rain outside had intensified, pelting against the windows like tiny fists demanding entrance, echoing the relentless worry hammering in Michael's chest. Mr. Reynolds, the veterinarian, Dr. Melissa Turner, according to her name badge, emerged through the swinging doors. Her expression was carefully neutral, but Michael had spent enough years reading people on construction sites to recognize the slight furrow between her brows, the tight set of her mouth that suggested bad news. "We've stabilized her for now, but I need to be honest with you. Her condition is serious." Michael nodded, a lump forming in his throat, as Dr. Turner led him into a small consultation room adorned with posters about heartworm prevention and dental care for pets. The absurd normalcy of these images, happy dogs with shining coats, content cats lounging in sunbeams, stood in stark contrast to the reality waiting for him. On the metal examination table lay the orange kitten, looking impossibly smaller under the harsh lights, an IV line inserted into her tiny leg, an oxygen mask fitted over her muzzle. She's suffering from dehydration, malnutrition, and a respiratory infection that's progressed dangerously, Dr. Turner explained, her voice gentle but clinical. Her left foreleg is broken in 2 places, and there's evidence of older injuries that have healed improperly. Additionally, there are signs of blunt force trauma to her skull, relatively recent within the past few days. The implications of these clinical terms hit Michael like physical blows. Someone hadn't just abandoned this cat, they had systematically abused her over time. The thought of it made his hands clench into fists, nails digging crescents into his palms. "Will she?" he began, unable to finish the question, as if speaking the possibility aloud might make it more real. "Doctor," Turner's eyes softened with compassion that seemed to go beyond professional empathy. "It's too early to give you any guarantees, Mr. Reynolds. The next 48 hours will be critical. We're giving her antibiotics for the infection, fluids for the dehydration, and pain medication for comfort. The broken leg will require surgery, but she's too weak right now to undergo anesthesia." Michael found himself nodding mechanically, his gaze fixed on the tiny rise and fall of the kitten's chest, each breath seeming like a small miracle. "I understand," he said, though he really couldn't comprehend the kind of cruelty that would lead to this moment. "What can I do? I don't—" He hesitated, embarrassed. "I don't have much money, but I can pay installments, whatever it takes." A flicker of surprise crossed Dr. Turner's face, quickly replaced by a warm smile that crinkled the corners of her eyes. "Most people in your position would be asking about the cheapest option to euthanize, Mr. Reynolds. The fact that you're standing here offering to pay for treatment for a stray cat you found on the road." She paused, shaking her head slightly. "Let's just say it restores a bit of my faith in humanity." Michael felt his cheeks warm with unexpected embarrassment, unsure how to respond to the veterinarian's praise. It wasn't heroism that had driven him to stop on that road, just basic decency, the minimum requirement for being human. "What's next?" he asked, redirecting the conversation to more practical matters, his eyes still on the kitten, whose orange fur seemed dull under the clinical lights. The treatment plan Dr. Turner outlined was extensive and, as Michael had feared, expensive. Antibiotics, fluids, oxygen therapy, surgery for the broken leg once the kitten was stable enough, possible neurological tests, depending on how she responded to initial treatment. Through it all, Michael nodded, signed forms, provided his credit card information, and tried not to think about the overtime he would need to request, the lunches he'd skip, the savings he'd drain, all for a cat he hadn't known existed 3 hours ago. "Does she have a name?" Dr. Turner asked as Michael prepared to leave, the kitten stabilized and set up in an oxygen tent for the night. The question caught him off guard. In the rush of discovery and emergency, naming the small creature hadn't crossed his mind. He looked at the kitten, her orange fur, her resilience despite overwhelming odds, and a memory surfaced, unbidden and bittersweet. "Phoenix," he said quietly, remembering his daughter's childhood fascination with mythology, the bedtime stories he'd read about creatures rising from ashes, reborn and transformed. "Her name is Phoenix, Doctor." Turner nodded approvingly, making a note on the chart, and promised to call if there were any changes overnight, good or bad. The drive home was a blur of streetlights and windshield wipers, Michael's mind replaying the evening's events on an endless loop. His empty house felt colder than usual as he moved through his nightly routine on autopilot. Shower, microwave dinner, local news playing in the background. The normalcy of these actions seemed incongruous with the seismic shift he felt internally, as if the discovery of Phoenix had cracked something open inside him that he hadn't realized was sealed. Sleep eluded Michael that night, his thoughts churning with images of Phoenix's trembling body, those haunting green eyes that seemed to hold both terror and an impossible trust. He found himself wondering about her life before the bag. Had she ever known kindness? Had she ever felt safe? The questions expanded, becoming more painful. Who would hurt her so deliberately? What kind of person would tie a living creature in a plastic bag and leave it to suffocate slowly or be crushed under car tires? The ringing of his phone jolted Michael from his troubled thoughts at 3:17 a.m. He lunged for it, heart pounding, certain it would be Dr. Turner with the worst possible news. Instead, it was his foreman Dave, asking if Michael could come in extra early. A pipe had burst at the site overnight, and they needed all hands on deck to mitigate the damage before it delayed the entire project schedule. For 3 days, Michael existed in a state of suspended animation, working double shifts at the construction site, stopping by the veterinary clinic during his lunch break, and again after work, sleeping fitfully for a few hours before starting the cycle again. Phoenix's condition remained precarious, hovering in that uncertain space between improvement and decline, where hope felt like a dangerous indulgence, something that could be snatched away with a single phone call. On the 4th morning, as Michael stood in line at the coffee shop near the clinic, his phone rang. Dr. Turner's number flashed on the screen, and he felt his heart seize, his finger trembling slightly as he swiped to answer. "Mr. Reynolds?" The veterinarian's voice was warm, a contrast to the clinical detachment of their previous conversations. "Phoenix opened her eyes this morning. She's not out of the woods yet, but she's fighting hard." Relief washed over Michael with such intensity that he had to step out of line, pressing his back against the cool brick wall of the coffee shop, eyes closed against the sudden burning sensation behind his lids. It wasn't a guarantee. Dr. Turner had been careful to emphasize that, but it was the first unequivocally positive development since he'd found Phoenix on that rain-soaked road. "Can I see her?" he asked, already calculating how much of his lunch break he could sacrifice, how late he'd have to stay at the site to make up the time. Dr. Turner hesitated, her silence stretching just long enough to make Michael's stomach clench with renewed anxiety. "Actually, that's the other reason I'm calling. Phoenix seems to respond uniquely to your voice. The nurses noticed it yesterday when they played the recording we made. Her heart rate stabilizes, her breathing evens out. It's quite remarkable, actually." The recording had been Dr. Turner's idea, a short audio clip of Michael speaking gentle reassurances, played periodically near Phoenix's kennel to provide a sense of continuity and comfort. He'd felt foolish making it, self-conscious about what the clinic staff might think of a grown man whispering encouragement to a cat who couldn't even hear him, but he'd done it anyway, desperate to help in any way he could. "We're planning to attempt the surgery on her leg today, and frankly, I think having you here might increase her chances of coming through it successfully," Dr. Turner continued, her tone shifting to a more professional register. "I understand that this is an unusual request and that you have work obligations, but if there's any way you could be here during the procedure, at least to sit with her during pre-op and recovery—" "I'll be there," Michael interrupted, already texting his foreman with his free hand, inventing a family emergency that wasn't entirely a lie. Phoenix had, in some indefinable way, become family over these anxious days of waiting. Dave would understand, or he wouldn't. Either way, Michael had already made his decision, prioritizing the small orange cat over the job that had been his sole focus for months. The surgery lasted 4 hours, 4 hours during which Michael sat in the clinic's small consultation room, alternating between pacing the limited floor space and staring out the window at the parking lot, where autumn leaves skittered across the asphalt in complex patterns that failed to distract him from his worry. Turner provided periodic updates. They'd successfully set the broken bones. They were checking for any other internal injuries. They were beginning to close, but the true verdict would come when Phoenix woke from anesthesia. Michael had never considered himself a religious man, but in those interminable hours, he found himself negotiating with whatever higher power might be listening. "Take anything from me," he thought, "just let her live." It was an irrational bargain, putting his own fate on the line for a stray cat, but in that moment it felt like the most logical equation in the world, his stability for her survival. "Mr. Reynolds?" Dr. Turner appeared in the doorway, surgical cap still on her head, mask pulled down around her neck. Her expression gave nothing away, and Michael felt his heart falter, preparing for the worst. "The surgery went as well as we could have hoped. Phoenix is in recovery now, and while we won't know the full extent of her improvement until she's fully awake, her vitals have remained stable throughout the procedure." Relief hit Michael with physical force, his knees weakening so suddenly that he had to reach for the edge of the table to steady himself. "Can I see her?" he asked, voice rough with emotion he couldn't quite name. Not just relief, but something deeper, a connection to this small creature that had somehow wound itself around his heart in less than a week. Dr. Turner nodded, gesturing for him to follow her through the clinic's back hallways, past examination rooms and supply closets to a small recovery area. Phoenix lay on a warming pad, her tiny body barely visible beneath a blanket designed for a much larger animal, monitoring equipment beeping softly in the background. Her left front leg was encased in a cast that seemed impossibly large for her diminutive frame, her eyes closed in drug-induced slumber. "Talk to her," Dr. Turner encouraged, checking an IV line with practiced efficiency. "She knows your voice. It will help her find her way back." The veterinarian retreated to the doorway, giving Michael privacy, while remaining close enough to intervene if Phoenix's condition changed. Michael felt awkward at first, self-conscious about speaking to an unconscious cat with an audience, however discreet. But as he gazed at Phoenix's small form, vulnerability overcame pride. "Hey there, fighter," he began softly, his calloused hand hovering uncertainly before gently stroking the top of her head. "You did great in there. A real champion." As if in response to his voice, Phoenix's whiskers twitched slightly. A subtle movement that might have been involuntary, but felt to Michael like recognition. Encouraged, he continued speaking, his voice growing more confident, weaving a narrative of the future that awaited her. Sunbeams to bask in, toys to chase, a window perch from which to survey the neighborhood, all the luxuries a cat could desire in a forever home. The word forever caught in Michael's throat, surprising him with its emotional impact. He hadn't consciously decided to keep Phoenix, had assumed in some vague way that once she recovered, he would find her a proper home with someone who knew how to care for cats, someone whose life was more settled than his. But speaking the possibility aloud made him realize how hollow that future seemed, how empty his house would feel without her presence. "I think she's coming around, Doctor," Turner said quietly from the doorway, moving forward to check Phoenix's vitals. Sure enough, the kitten's eyelids were fluttering, her breathing becoming more pronounced. "Keep talking," the veterinarian encouraged, adjusting something on the IV. "She's responding to you." Michael resumed his one-sided conversation, describing his house to Phoenix in detail. The sunny spot in the living room where he'd place her bed, the spare bedroom he'd been using for storage that could be renovated into a cat room, complete with climbing shelves and hiding places. As he spoke, Phoenix's eyes opened fully for the first time since surgery, those vivid green irises focusing on Michael's face with what seemed like recognition. A small raspy sound emerged from Phoenix's throat, not quite a meow, more like a question mark made audible. Her paw, the one not encased in plaster, reached toward Michael with trembling effort. Without thinking, he offered his finger, and Phoenix wrapped her tiny paw around it, holding on with surprising strength for a creature so recently on death's doorstep. "Well, Doctor," Turner said softly, a smile evident in her voice, though Michael couldn't tear his gaze from Phoenix to confirm it visually. "I think we know who she's choosing as her person." The simple statement carried the weight of prophecy, a decision already made between man and cat that paperwork would merely formalize. Phoenix came home on a Tuesday, exactly 2 weeks after Michael had found her abandoned in that plastic bag. The transition was far from seamless. She startled at sudden movements, cowered at loud noises, and spent the first 3 days hiding beneath Michael's bed, emerging only when the house was completely silent and her hunger outweighed her fear. Michael learned patience in those days, sitting quietly on the floor near her hiding spot, reading aloud from whatever book was at hand, simply existing in her space without expectation. On the 4th night, Michael woke at 3 a.m. to a strange sensation on his chest, a warm, vibrating weight that momentarily confused his sleep-addled brain. Opening his eyes, he found Phoenix curled into a tight orange ball over his heart, her broken leg awkwardly extended, her purr a rumbling engine against his sternum. He remained perfectly still, afraid any movement might startle her back under the bed, this tentative trust broken before it had properly formed. "Hey there," he whispered, keeping his voice pitched low and gentle. Phoenix opened one eye, regarding him with what seemed like deliberation before closing it again, her purr intensifying slightly. Permission, Michael thought, for him to acknowledge her presence without disturbing her rest. Carefully, moving with exaggerated slowness, he lifted one hand to stroke her head, his rough fingertips gentle against her delicate skull. The moment felt sacred, this small creature choosing to trust him despite every reason her past had given her to fear humans. Michael found himself blinking against unexpected moisture in his eyes, a lump forming in his throat as Phoenix tilted her head to press more firmly into his palm, seeking the contact she had fled from just days earlier. Progress would be measured in these small moments, he realized. Little victories that others might find insignificant, but that represented monumental shifts in Phoenix's damaged worldview. Days turned to weeks, and Phoenix's physical wounds healed with the resilience of youth. Her cast removed, her respiratory infection cleared, her once dull coat now gleaming with health under Michael's attentive care. The emotional scars proved more persistent, manifesting in moments of inexplicable terror. She would be playing contentedly one moment, only to bolt for cover the next, triggered by some shadow or sound that resonated with her traumatic past. Michael researched feline psychology in his spare time, joining online forums for owners of abused cats, absorbing advice from veterinary behaviorists, and implementing their suggestions with dedicated consistency. He created predictable routines to give Phoenix security, provided elevated perches where she could observe her domain without feeling trapped, and learned to recognize the subtle ear flicks and tail twitches that preceded her anxiety attacks, intervening with gentle distraction before fear could overwhelm her. The changes in Michael's life extended beyond his relationship with Phoenix. His house, once a place he merely slept in between work shifts, became a home filled with cat toys, climbing structures, and the warm presence of another living being. He found himself leaving work on time rather than volunteering for overtime, eager to return to Phoenix and their evening ritual of playtime, followed by quiet companionship on the couch, where she would curl against his thigh as he read or watched television. "You've done an amazing job with her," Dr. Turner remarked during Phoenix's 3-month checkup, watching as the cat confidently explored the examination room, no longer cowering from the veterinarian's touch. Most cats with her history would never recover this level of socialization. "She clearly feels safe with you. That's no small accomplishment, Mr. Reynolds." Michael shrugged, uncomfortable with the praise but pleased by the professional confirmation of what he'd observed himself. Phoenix was healing, not just physically but emotionally, learning to trust in a world that had given her every reason for suspicion. "We're figuring it out together," he said simply, watching as Phoenix returned to him, rubbing against his ankles in a display of affection that still felt like a gift. The call from the police came 6 months after Michael had found Phoenix, a detective named Rivera seeking information about the cat he'd reportedly rescued from the side of Evergreen Road. "We've arrested someone for animal cruelty cases in your area," Detective Rivera explained, her voice matter-of-fact over the phone. "Multiple incidents involving cats, most of them fatal. We believe your cat may have been a victim of the same perpetrator. Her case could strengthen our prosecution if you're willing to testify." The request revived memories Michael had tried to suppress, Phoenix trembling in that tied plastic bag, her broken body on the examination table, the long nights of uncertainty about her survival. His instinct was to refuse, to protect both Phoenix and himself from revisiting that trauma, to focus on the present rather than dwelling on a past they'd worked so hard to overcome. But as he watched Phoenix playing in the afternoon sunlight, fearlessly pouncing on a toy mouse with all the confidence of a cat who knew herself to be loved and safe, Michael realized he owed it to the cats who hadn't survived, who hadn't been found by someone willing to stop on a rainy evening. "I'll help however I can," he told Detective Rivera, his voice steadier than he felt. "Just tell me what you need from us." The preparation for the trial forced Michael to articulate Phoenix's story in painful detail. The condition he'd found her in, the extent of her injuries, the long road of her recovery. Each retelling felt like reopening a wound, but there was healing in it too, a sense that Phoenix's suffering might serve some greater purpose, might prevent other animals from enduring similar fates. Phoenix seemed to sense his distress during this period, becoming more attentive, sleeping closer to his head at night, greeting him at the door with more enthusiastic displays of affection when he returned from meetings with the prosecutor. It was as if their roles had reversed, the cat now comforting the human, offering silent support in the face of emotional turbulence, just as he had once done for her. The defendant, a middle-aged man named Harlan Weber with no prior criminal record, pleaded guilty before the trial began, accepting a plea bargain that included psychiatric treatment alongside his incarceration. Michael felt a complex mix of emotions at the news: relief at being spared the ordeal of testifying, disappointment at the lack of closure a trial might have provided, and a lingering, unresolved anger toward the man who had so callously discarded Phoenix like trash. "You should be proud," Detective Rivera told him when she called with news of the plea, her voice warm with approval. "The evidence we gathered in Phoenix's case was compelling. The distinctive knot used to tie the bag matched Weber's other crime scenes. Your decision to preserve that evidence, to seek medical attention for her rather than simply freeing her, it made a difference. The other victims got justice because you did the right thing that night." 1 year to the day after Michael found Phoenix on that rain-slicked road, he sat on his living room floor, watching as she chased a feather toy with athletic grace, no sign remaining of the broken leg that had once threatened her mobility. Her orange coat gleamed like burnished copper in the afternoon sunlight streaming through the windows, her movements confident and playful, a stark contrast to the trembling, traumatized kitten she had once been. "Look at you now," Michael murmured, smiling as Phoenix executed a particularly impressive leap to capture the feather, her green eyes bright with the simple joy of the hunt. She had grown from that half-starved kitten into a sleek, healthy cat with a distinctive personality, fiercely independent yet deeply affectionate, cautious with strangers but unguardedly loving toward Michael, a perfect balance of wildness and domesticity that continued to fascinate him. The changes in Michael's own life were equally profound, though less immediately visible. The photographs on his mantelpiece told part of the story, new images of his daughter's visits home, the two of them laughing as Phoenix investigated the unfamiliar human with curious caution. His relationship with Emma had been strained since the divorce, but Phoenix had provided neutral ground, a shared interest that allowed them to rebuild their connection one weekend visit at a time. His house had transformed as well, no longer the sparse bachelor space it had once been. Bookshelves now lined the walls, filled with volumes on feline behavior, veterinary medicine, and psychology, subjects that had captured Michael's interest during Phoenix's recovery. A certificate of completion from a veterinary assistant training program hung framed in the hallway, testament to the night classes he'd begun taking 6 months ago, inspired by his experience with Dr. Turner. The construction job remained, bills needed paying, and Michael had discovered he enjoyed the tangible satisfaction of building something with his hands, but it no longer defined him completely. 3 evenings a week, he volunteered at a local animal shelter, working specifically with traumatized cats, applying the patience and techniques he had developed with Phoenix to help other feline survivors prepare for their forever homes. His phone chimed with a message from Emma. She'd be arriving tomorrow for her monthly visit, bringing her roommate's new rescue kitten for socialization guidance from the Phoenix Whisperer, as she teasingly called her father's newfound expertise. Michael smiled at the nickname, remembering how skeptical Emma had initially been about his attachment to Phoenix, how quickly her skepticism had turned to admiration as she witnessed the depth of the bond between man and cat. Phoenix, apparently satisfied with her hunting prowess, abandoned the feather toy and leapt gracefully onto the couch, settling herself against Michael's side with a contented purr. He stroked her head automatically, the gesture as natural now as breathing, marveling at the softness of her fur beneath his work-roughened hands. "You saved me too," he told her quietly, words he'd spoken before, but that never lost their truth. And she had saved him, though Michael couldn't have articulated exactly how when he first found her. Couldn't have known that rescuing this small creature would reconnect him not just with his daughter, but with parts of himself he'd believed lost after the divorce. Through caring for Phoenix, he had discovered reservoirs of patience, compassion, and tenderness he hadn't known he possessed, qualities that had expanded beyond his relationship with the cat to enrich all aspects of his life. The story of a man and the cat he rescued from a plastic bag might seem insignificant against the backdrop of global tragedies and triumphs, a small tale of everyday heroism easily overlooked. But in that ordinary miracle lay a profound truth, that sometimes salvation comes in unexpected forms, that the beings we rescue may ultimately rescue us in ways we never anticipated. Life would continue to present challenges, of course. Phoenix might live another decade or more, or she might face health issues in her future. Michael's career change from construction to veterinary work would require further education and financial sacrifices. Relationships with family and friends would ebb and flow with the natural tide of human connection. But whatever came next, they would face it together, this improbable family forged in a moment of crisis on a rain-soaked Oregon road. "What do you think, Phoenix?" Michael asked, scratching behind her ears in the spot she preferred. "Ready for whatever comes next?" Phoenix responded by stretching luxuriously against him, her purr intensifying, green eyes half closed in contentment. Not an answer in human terms, perhaps, but a declaration of trust and presence that transcended language, a promise to remain by his side through whatever the future held.